The letter hit the table like a gunshot. Sadie Blackwell did not flinch. She had trained herself out of flinching years ago, the same way she had trained herself out of crying, out of hoping, out of wearing anything that couldn't withstand a full day's labor without showing the dirt. She pressed her palms flat against the scarred wood and read the words again, though she had already read them 4 times, and each time they carved themselves a little deeper into the place behind her sternum where she kept the things she refused to feel. "You have 30 days," the letter said. 30 days to produce full payment on the outstanding debt of $412, or the property known as Blackwell Homestead, located in Cutters Creek, Texas, will be seized by Harlan Morse on behalf of the Morse Land and Cattle Company. This is not a negotiation. This is a finality. Harlan Morse. That name had been a shadow over her life since she was 16 years old. Since her father had shaken the man's hand and borrowed money he never had any real hope of paying back. Now her father was 3 years in the ground, her mother 2 years before him, and the debt had passed to Sadie the way everything in her life had passed to Sadie, without ceremony, without mercy, without anyone asking whether she could carry it. She folded the letter with precise, mechanical movements. She pressed the crease sharp. She set it on the shelf above the fireplace next to her father's pocket watch, which had stopped working 4 years ago and which she kept wound anyway out of a habit she couldn't explain. It was April of 1882. The bluebonnets were coming up in the south field. She had 30 days. What happened next, she told herself, she would handle practically. She would handle it the way she handled everything, with clear eyes, a steady hand, and absolutely no room for the kind of desperate fantasy that had destroyed her mother and wasted her father and left so many women in these Texas hills staring at the ceiling at night wondering how their lives had become the things they were. She had worn practicality like a second skin her entire adult life. It had kept her alive. It had kept the homestead standing for 3 years after her father died. It had kept the livestock fed and the roof patched and the garden growing and the bills, most of the bills, paid. She pulled on her work gloves. She went outside into the April morning. She did not yet know that before these 30 days were finished, a rancher named Silas Collier was going to walk up her porch steps and look at her as though practicality had never been the whole of her, as though something warmer and deeper and more recklessly alive had always been living just underneath, waiting for someone patient enough to see it. She did not yet know that he was going to stay. 3 weeks earlier, the town of Cutters Creek had not known what to make of Silas Collier either. He had ridden in on a big roan gelding on a Tuesday afternoon in late March, with a bedroll, a pair of saddlebags, and the particular kind of quiet that made people in small Texas towns either very trusting or very suspicious, depending on their natures. He had taken a room at the Alderman Hotel, which was less a hotel than a 2-story building where aldermen rented rooms to people she approved of and turned away people she didn't, and he had sat down at the counter of Gruber's General Store and asked for coffee and whether there was any land for lease in the county. Word got around fast. Word always got around fast in Cutters Creek. He was 31 years old. He had come from Abilene before that, and from somewhere in Kansas before that, and there was some complicated history with a cattle operation north of the Red River that people referenced in low voices without ever fully explaining. He was broad through the shoulders, dark-haired, with hands that showed years of serious work and eyes that were a quiet, uncommon shade of gray that people tended to notice and then feel strange about having noticed. He was not running from anything, as far as anyone could determine, which in 1882 in western Texas was either the most reassuring thing about a man or the most suspicious. What he was, Sadie would come to understand much later, was a man who had spent years building something and then watched it fall apart through no catastrophic betrayal or dark secret, but simply through the accumulation of hard seasons, bad luck, and one business partner whose word had turned out to be worth considerably less than the handshake it had been delivered with. He had sold what remained. He had paid his debts, every one of them, even the ones he hadn't technically been required to pay. And then he had ridden south because he needed somewhere new to start, and a cattle operation in Cutter's Creek had come up in conversation in a saloon in Abilene as a thing that might be possible for a man with skill and some remaining capital and a willingness to work. Sadie did not know any of this the first time she saw him. The first time she saw him, she was at Gruber's General Store buying flour and examining a new shipment of nails with the focused attention of a woman who understood exactly what kind of nails were right for what kind of repair job, and was not willing to be sold the wrong kind. Thomas Gruber, who was 60 years old and had sold Sadie everything from boot leather to beeswax for the past 15 years, was explaining with some exasperation that these were the same nails she always bought, and Sadie was explaining with great patience and specificity that these were actually 3-penny nails, and she needed 4-penny nails, and the difference mattered if you were repairing a fence post and not just tacking trim. She was aware, in the peripheral way of someone who has grown up in a small town, that a stranger was at the other end of the counter. She did not look at him directly. She had flour to buy and nails to sort out and a fence post situation that was not going to resolve itself. "She's right," the stranger said. Thomas Gruber and Sadie Blackwell both turned to look at him. He was leaning against the counter with his coffee cup, and he had the look of someone who had not intended to speak, but found the conversation too specifically correct to stay silent about. 4-penny for fence post work. 3-penny pulls out under pressure. Thomas Gruber looked at him. Thomas Gruber looked at Sadie. Thomas Gruber, who had 30 years of experience recognizing when he was outnumbered on questions of hardware, went a look in the back for the 4-penny nails. Sadie looked at the stranger. He had gray eyes and he was not smiling exactly, but there was something in his expression that was not quite neutral either, a kind of attention that was different from the kind she usually got, which was either the practical assessment of a neighbor checking on a woman running a homestead alone, or the patronizing concern of someone who thought a woman alone needed managing. This was neither of those things. She couldn't immediately name what it was. "Thank you," she said, because she had been raised to be courteous even when she was uncertain. "Silas Collier," he said. "Sadie Blackwell," she said. He nodded. She nodded. Thomas Gruber came back with the 4-penny nails. Sadie paid for her flour and her nails and walked out into the March afternoon with the particular feeling of someone who has left a room and is not entirely sure why they keep thinking about it. She told herself it was the nails. She had been right about the nails. That was satisfying. That was all it was. She drove her wagon home. She mended the fence post. She did not think about gray eyes or the particular quality of someone's attention. She thought about the mortgage. She thought about the 30 days, which she did not yet know about but which were coming toward her like whether she could feel in the air before she could see it in the sky. The town of Cutter's Creek sat in the hill country of central Texas, a settlement of perhaps 400 people that had grown up around a trading post and a creek and had in the past 20 years accumulated the things that small Texas towns accumulated when they lasted long enough. A general store, a church, a livery stable, a blacksmith, a doctor who was also the barber, a schoolhouse with a rotating cast of exhausted teachers, 2 saloons, and the particular social architecture of a place where everyone knew everyone's business and felt they had a responsibility to weigh in on it. The land around it was hill country land cedar and live oak and limestone outcroppings, good grass in wet years and brutal in dry ones, the kind of country that rewarded stubbornness and punished anything softer than stone. The Blackwell homestead was 4 miles east of town, 80 acres of mixed grass and cedar, with a farmhouse, a barn, a smokehouse, a spring-fed stock tank, and a kitchen garden that Sadie had expanded every year since her mother died because keeping things growing felt like the most concrete argument she could make against despair. It was good land. Not spectacular land, not the rich bottomland further east, but solid, honest, workable land. Her father had homesteaded it in 1866, come down from Missouri after the war with her mother and a wagon of tools, and the specific blind optimism of a man who has survived something terrible and decided the surviving must mean something. He had built the house himself, log by log, and then added the barn, and then cleared the east field for crops and left the west pasture for cattle. He had also borrowed money from Harlan Morse in 1871, when a drought killed most of the herd, and the only alternative was watching everything he'd built fall apart. He had paid interest on that loan faithfully for 11 years. He had never managed to pay the principal. Harlan Morse was not, by the standards of 1882 Western Texas, an unusual man. He was a land gatherer, the kind of man who had appeared all over the frontier in the decades after the Civil War, using credit and debt and the particular vulnerability of small homesteaders to accumulate acreage that would have taken him generations to buy outright. He was not a villain from a story. He was a function of an economic system that ground small farmers down and gathered the pieces, and he was very good at what he did. He was also, in Sadie's personal experience, a man who smiled with his mouth and not his eyes and who had called her little girl at her father's funeral, which she had neither forgotten nor forgiven. She had known the debt was there. She had been making the interest payments herself for 3 years. What she had not known, what the letter informed her with the legal precision of a man who had done this many times before, was that the loan contained a provision, buried in the original documents her father had signed without the benefit of a lawyer, that allowed Morse to call the full principal due upon the death of the original borrower. He had waited 3 years to exercise that provision. She suspected, with the cold logic of a woman who had been dealing with practical realities her entire life, that he had waited until she had enough invested in maintaining the property to make losing it maximally painful. $412 in 1882. For a woman running a homestead alone, she had perhaps $60 in savings. She could sell cattle. She had a small herd, 14 head, and maybe clear another 150 if the market held. That left over $200 she did not have and had no immediate way to get. She had gone over the numbers every night for a week. She had gone over them in bed and at the kitchen table and while doing chores and while staring at the spring-fed stock tank in the early morning before the rest of the world woke up. The numbers did not change. The numbers were the numbers. On the 8th day after receiving the letter, she drove into town to speak with Judge Alderman, who was me Alderman's husband and the closest thing Cutter's Creek had to legal counsel for people who couldn't afford a lawyer. He read the document carefully. He read it twice. He set it down with the look of a man who has just confirmed a diagnosis he was hoping to be wrong about. "The provision is legal," he said. "I'm sorry, Sadie. Your father signed this freely. There's no fraud here, just bad terms." "Bad terms," she repeated. "The only way out is payment, full payment within the window specified." She nodded. She took the document back. She folded it with the same precise mechanical movements she always used for things she needed to keep and not break down over. She was 27 years old. She had been handling things practically since she was 14. She was not about to stop now. She drove home. She made a list of every possible source of money available to her. She was a practical woman. She would work through the list. What she did not put on the list, because it had not yet occurred to her as a real thing, was Silas Collier. He had been in town 3 weeks by then. She had spoken to him twice more. Once when they had ended up at neighboring tables at the church potluck, where he had eaten quietly and answered me Alderman's interrogation about his origins and intentions with patient, complete answers that gave me nothing to disapprove of. And once in the street, when he had been leaving the livery, and she had been heading to the post office, and they had both stopped at the same moment to let a wagon pass, and ended up standing next to each other for the 30 seconds it took. He had asked about her fence post, whether the 4-penny nails had done the job. She had said yes, they had done the job, thank you for your input. He had said it was a small thing. She had said it wasn't actually. A fence post that held was the difference between cattle staying where they were supposed to stay and cattle wandering into trouble, which in ranching country was never a small distinction. He had looked at her for a moment with that quality of attention she still hadn't managed to name, and said that she was right, and that he had meant the input was a small thing to offer, not that the nails were. She had felt her face do something she wasn't prepared for and had said good day and gone to the post office. She thought about it later in the way she thought about things she wanted to file away and stop thinking about. The difference between a small input and a small matter. The precision of that distinction. The fact that he had clarified it without being asked. She did not put Silas Collier on the list of potential solutions to the mortgage problem. She put him in a different part of her mind, in the part where she kept things she didn't know what to do with yet. The list of solutions looked like this, in order of practicality. First, sell the cattle now, all 14 head, accepting whatever the current market price was. Second, sell or lease the north 40 acres, which she had been meaning to do for 2 years since she couldn't work that much land alone anyway. Third, ask for a loan from the cattlemen's cooperative, which had a lending arm that charged lower interest than the banks and was generally more sympathetic to small operators. Fourth, write to her mother's brother in Missouri, who had some money and some sympathy, but was not a man who parted easily with either. She worked through the list in order. She drove her cattle to the Cutter's Creek stockyards on a Wednesday morning, all 14 head, and the drover told her the market was soft and offered her $90 for the lot. She argued him up to $105. She drove home with $105 and no cattle and the specific feeling of a woman who has sold something she needed to keep herself alive in the short term and has now lost it. She went to the cattlemen's cooperative on Thursday. The man she spoke with, a banker named Percival Hatch, listened to her situation with genuine sympathy and absolutely no ability to help. The cooperative's lending arm required collateral. Her collateral was the homestead itself, which was already encumbered by the Morse debt. He was sorry. He was genuinely sorry. It was still no. She wrote to her uncle in Missouri. She was precise and honest and not dramatic about it. She explained the situation. She asked for $200 as a loan, not a gift, and offered to pay it back at reasonable interest. She posted the letter and then did the math on how long it would take a letter to reach Missouri and a reply to come back, and understood that even in the best possible case she was looking at 6 weeks, which was 2 weeks past her deadline. She looked at the north 40 acres. A neighbor, old Ben Calloway, had been talking about wanting more grazing land for years. She went to see him on Friday morning. He was a fair man and she respected him, and she thought there was a real possibility here. Ben Calloway had broken his hip 3 weeks prior. His son was running things. His son was 22 years old and had inherited neither his father's fairness nor his father's affection for the Blackwell family, and he offered her $60 for 40 acres of good Texas hill country because he knew she was desperate and he was, in this specific way, very much his own person and not his father's. She drove home. She sat at the kitchen table. She looked at her list. $105 from the cattle, $60 of her own savings. The North 40 was her only remaining option, and the best she was going to get for it at current circumstances was $60 from a man who was taking advantage of her. That was $225. She needed $412. She was $187 short with 22 days remaining. She sat with that number for a long time. Then she did something she had not allowed herself to do since she was 19 years old, and a boy she had cared about had left Cutter's Creek for California, and she had stood in the road watching him go and understood with a kind of sudden adult clarity that caring about people was an extremely efficient way to arrange to be hurt by them. She put her head down on the kitchen table and she breathed through the specific geography of despair, Not crying, not quite, but acknowledging it, because she was alone and the lamp was low and there was no one to see her be anything other than practical. She stayed there for exactly 12 minutes. She counted. Then she lifted her head. She smoothed her hair. She blew out the lamp and went to bed, because there was nothing useful to be accomplished by sitting in the dark. And tomorrow she would think of something she hadn't thought of yet. What she thought of, at 5 in the morning while feeding the chickens in the cold April dawn, was that she knew nothing about leasing the North 40 as opposed to selling it, and that if she could lease it for enough per annum, she might be able to use it as partial collateral for a private loan from someone who wasn't a bank. She knew almost nothing about private lending arrangements. What she knew about was practical matters. She knew fences and soil and livestock and crop rotation, and the specific economics of a small hill country homestead. She did not know the mechanisms of private debt. She realized, standing in the chicken yard at 5 in the morning, thinking about the man at the general store who had known about four-penny nails and had a particular quality of attention she still hadn't managed to name. She was thinking about the fact that he had come to Cutter's Creek looking to start a cattle operation, which meant he had capital, which meant he was the kind of man who understood private financial arrangements. She stood there for a while with the chicken feed in her hands. She was practical. She was not naive. She knew the kind of situation a woman alone got herself into when she went to a man she barely knew and asked for money. She knew every version of how that story could go wrong. She also knew that the alternative was losing her father's land to Harlan Morse in 22 days. She put the chicken feed away. She went inside. She combed her hair and put on her second-best dress, which was still primarily a work dress but was clean and pressed, because she was not going to ask anyone for anything looking like she'd already given up. She hitched her horse to the wagon. She drove to town. She found Silas Collier at the livery stable, which was where she had been told he spent his mornings, apparently in the process of negotiating the purchase of additional horses for the operation he was in the preliminary stages of establishing on leased land 3 miles north of town. He was talking to the livery owner, a man named Duff Sherwood, with the focused attention of someone who was in the middle of something. But when she came through the stable doors, he looked up immediately and his expression shifted into that quality, that specific, unnamed quality that she was going to have to find a name for eventually. "Miss Blackwell," he said, not surprised. Not particularly, anyway. "Mr. Collier," she said, "I need to speak with you, when you have time. It's a business matter." Duff Sherwood's eyes went back and forth between them with the delighted alertness of a man who could smell a story. "I have time now," Silas said. They walked out of the stable and down the street to the bench outside Gruber's General Store, which was a public enough location to be respectable and quiet enough at this hour to allow a real conversation. She sat. He sat. She looked at her hands for a moment, which were bare because she had left her work gloves at home because they were work gloves, and this was not precisely a work call. She told him everything. She told him about the debt and the letter and the 30 days and the provision her father had signed and the numbers, every number in precise order. She told him what she had already done and what it had yielded. She told him about the North 40 acres and the lease value she estimated it at. She told him what she needed. She did not editorialize. She did not perform distress. She laid out the situation the way she laid out every problem, in its actual dimensions, without exaggeration or minimization, because in her experience the only way to solve a real problem was to look at exactly what it actually was. When she finished, there was a short silence. "You're asking me to lend you money," he said. "I am," she said. "I'm offering the lease on the North 40 as collateral at a fair rate with a repayment schedule I can realistically meet. I have terms written out." She took a folded piece of paper from her dress pocket and held it out to him. He took it. He read it. He read it twice, carefully, the way a man reads something he's taking seriously. She watched his face while he read it, and his face was doing the thing faces do when they are actually thinking. not performing thinking. The small shifts of attention and calculation that a person can't really fake. He folded the paper and held it in both hands and looked at the street for a moment. "Your terms are fair," he said. "I know they are," she said. Not arrogance, just accuracy. She had spent 2 days on those terms. He looked at her then with the full weight of whatever that quality was, and she had the strange, unwelcome, extremely inconvenient feeling of being entirely seen by someone, which was not a feeling she had any real framework for because she had been operating for so long in the mode of someone who managed things and was capable and was not a person things happened to but a person who made decisions. And being seen was different from being assessed, and she hadn't entirely expected it. "I'll need to review the land documents," he said. "If they're in order, I can have the money to you by the end of the week." She breathed out very slowly through her nose. "Thank you," she said. "It's a fair arrangement," he said, "for both of us." She looked at him. "Why are you being straightforward about this?" He seemed to consider the question as though it deserved a real answer rather than a dismissal. "Because you were straightforward with me," he said, "and because I've seen enough people bury problems in pride until the problems got too big to dig out. You came and laid yours flat on the table. That deserves the same thing back." She did not know what to do with that. So she did what she did with things she didn't know what to do with. She filed it away for later and dealt with the immediate practical matter. She brought him the land documents that afternoon. He spent 2 hours with them and asked her 4 specific, intelligent questions about the property boundaries and the water rights and the existing fence lines. She answered all 4 questions with complete accuracy, and he wrote notes in a small leather notebook. And she watched him write and thought about the fact that he was the first person in years who had asked about her property like. It was a thing worth understanding rather than a problem worth having an opinion on. 2 days later, he came to the homestead. This was the first time he had come to the homestead and the first time she had seen him outside of town, and there was something subtly different about him in this context. Not less guarded, because he hadn't seemed guarded exactly, but more present maybe, the way some people are more themselves outdoors than in. He rode up the lane on his roan gelding in the early afternoon light, and she was in the garden, which was where she often was in the afternoons, and she stood up and shielded her eyes against the sun to look at him. He looked at the homestead, the house, the barn, the garden, the cedar breaks on the north edge of the property, with the specific attention of someone who is seeing a place rather than just a piece of paper, and something in his expression was careful in a way she noticed. She brought him around to show him the North 40. It took most of an hour, walking the boundary lines, checking the fence state, looking at the grass quality and the small seasonal creek that ran through the northeast corner. He asked questions the whole time, not the questions of a man making polite conversation but the questions of someone building a real picture, and she answered them all and found, at some point that she could not precisely locate, that she had stopped managing the conversation and was simply having it. He knew cattle. He knew land. He knew the specific calculations of hill country grazing, how many acres per head, how to rotate to prevent overgraze, what a seasonal creek was worth in dry summer months versus spring. They disagreed about the creek. She thought it ran longer into summer than he was crediting, and she had data, 3 years of observation, and she told him so with precision, and he listened to her data and said she was probably right and modified his estimate. She thought about that later, not the estimate, the fact that he had said she was probably right and modified his estimate. She had spent her adult life in a world where being correct and being believed were 2 entirely different things, and mostly she had stopped expecting the second one and focused on just being the first one, because at least accuracy was something she could control. This man had heard her evidence and updated his position. It was so simple it should not have felt significant, and yet it did. They walked back to the house. She made coffee, the good coffee, not the weak stuff she made when it was just herself, and they sat at the kitchen table, which felt strange in a way she couldn't quite rationalize. A man at her kitchen table, not a neighbor or someone her father had known, but a stranger who was not entirely a stranger anymore. He had the money in an envelope. He set it on the table between them along with a handwritten loan document that covered every point of her original terms and included 2 additions that she read carefully. A clause extending the repayment window if there was a significant drought year, and a statement that the North 40 lease rights reverted cleanly to her upon full repayment with no further claim. She looked up at him. "You added provisions in my favor," she said. "I added provisions that are fair," he said. "Most people adding provisions add them in their own favor." "I know," he said. She read the document twice. She picked up the pen he had brought and signed her name at the bottom in her clean, precise handwriting. He signed his name below hers. They shook hands across the kitchen table. His hand was large and warm and had the calluses of real work, and her hand was the same because she had been doing real work since she was old enough to be useful, and the handshake was firm and equal, and she felt it for longer after than handshakes usually lasted. "I'll pay Morse on Monday," she said. "Good," he said. He finished his coffee. He stood to leave. At the door he stopped and turned back, not with the hesitation of a man about to say something he's been calculating, but with the naturalness of someone who simply has one more thing to say. "Your place is good land," he said. "I can see what you've built here. It's real." She was standing in the doorway of her parents' house in the afternoon light with $412 in an envelope on her kitchen table, and the specific weight of everything she had been carrying for 3 years was fractionally, not entirely but fractionally, less heavy for a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." He nodded once, settled his hat, and walked down her porch steps to his horse. She watched him ride down the lane until the cedar brakes swallowed him up. She went inside and made herself eat dinner because it was dinner time and eating was practical, and she did not sit at the kitchen table looking at the door he had walked out of for more than 10 minutes before she made herself stand up and do the dishes. Monday morning, she drove to Harlan Morse's office, which was in a large, deliberately imposing stone building on the main street of Cutter's Creek that he had built to look like prosperity and authority pressed into architecture. His secretary, a thin, nervous man named Whitfield, took her name and made her wait 20 minutes on a bench in the hall, which was also deliberate. She knew. The making her wait was a power mechanism, and she recognized it as such and sat with her hands folded and her spine straight and her face at its most neutral. Harlan Morse was in his mid-50s, wide through the middle, with the look of a man who had been physically capable once and had since redirected that energy into the kind of dominance that worked better from behind a desk. He smiled when she came in. The smile did not reach his eyes, which were small and very attentive. "Miss Blackwell," he said, "I'm glad you've come. I was worried you might need more time." "I have your payment," she said. She put the envelope on his desk without ceremony. He looked at the envelope, he looked at her. He picked it up and counted it, which she had expected and which did not bother her because she had counted it twice herself. "Full payment," he said, "all $412. Plus the standard release fee, which I've included," she said. "I'd like the debt instrument marked paid and returned to me today." A very small, very controlled something moved through his expression. He had been expecting her to fail. She could see that clearly now. The 3-year wait, the precise timing of the letter, the 30-day window, it had all been calibrated to a woman he had assessed as having no real options. He had been wrong about her options. She watched him absorb that. "Of course," he said. His voice was entirely smooth. He was too experienced to let the setback show in any visible way, but she saw the moment of recalibration and she filed it carefully away. A man like Harlan Morse did not simply accept a defeat and move on. He noted it. She would need to remember that. Whitfield produced the debt instrument. Morse stamped it paid and signed it and handed it across the desk. She took it with both hands and held it for a moment. This document, 11 years old, that had been a shadow over her entire adult life. And then she folded it with the same precise crease she used for everything and put it in her pocket. She walked out of Harlan Morse's building and into the April morning, and the bluebonnets were coming up along the roadside, and she had $37 left to her name, and the deed to her land was unencumbered for the first time in her adult life. She stood on the boardwalk and breathed the spring air and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time, which was something adjacent to freedom, something that was not quite joy but was in the same general country. She went to Gruber's General Store. She bought flour and coffee and a bag of dried beans, and on impulse, a small tin of hard candy that she had no practical reason to buy, which was the most impractical thing she had done in years, and it cost 5 cents, and she ate one piece of peppermint on the walk back to her wagon, and it tasted like something. She drove home. She did her afternoon chores. She fed the chickens and checked on the stock tank and repaired a small section of kitchen garden fence that had been low on her priority list, while the mortgage crisis consumed everything. And then, because it was correct to do, and because she was a woman who believed in correctness, she rode over to the North 40 to check the fence lines, which were now technically Silas Collier's leased land, and found him already there with 2 men she didn't recognize, checking the same fence lines from the other side. He raised a hand when he saw her. She rode up to the fence line. He was on the other side of it, which felt like a metaphor she was not going to pursue. "Payment's done," she said. "Land's clear. The arrangement stands." "Good," he said. He looked at her with that attention again. In the afternoon light, with the hill country spread out behind him and the spring grass coming in green and the cedar breaks dark against the sky, he looked like someone who belonged in this landscape, which was something she noticed about people, whether they belonged in places or were just passing through them. "I'm glad it worked out," he said, and then, carefully, "You did that yourself, you know. I provided a mechanism. You had already done everything else." She looked at him across the fence line. She thought about saying something dismissive and practical. She thought about filing this away in the place where she kept things she didn't know what to do with. Instead, she said, "Come to dinner on Friday. It's the correct thing to do after a business arrangement of this kind, a proper dinner, as thanks." She was extremely surprised to hear herself say this. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who was being careful not to look too pleased about something. "Friday," he said. "Yes, thank you." She rode home faster than necessary and spent the rest of the afternoon being extremely focused on practical tasks and not thinking about it. Friday came. She made a real dinner: roast pork from a joint she had been saving, cornbread, beans with onion, apple preserves from last fall's canning. She set the table properly. She wore her actual good dress, which was a deep green wool chally that her mother had made her for her 21st birthday, and which she wore perhaps 3 times a year to church, and on the rare occasions when the occasion warranted it. She stood in front of the small mirror in her bedroom and looked at herself in the green dress and thought about what she was doing. She was having a business associate to dinner. She was being correct and courteous and properly thankful for a legitimate business arrangement. That was what this was. Her reflection looked back at her with the specific expression of a woman who is explaining something to herself that she is not entirely convinced by. He arrived at 6 o'clock with a bottle of Madeira wine, which was not something men brought to business dinners in the hill country of Central Texas in 1882, and which therefore immediately complicated the narrative she had been working with. She thanked him for it. She found 2 glasses. She poured it, and the color was dark red-brown, and the smell of it in her kitchen was strange and good and foreign. They sat at the table and she served dinner, and the conversation began in the comfortable territory of the practical. The North 40, the cattle he was bringing in, the fence repairs he was planning, the grass quality this spring. And then it moved gradually in the way that conversations move when both people in them are actually present and actually listening, into other territory. She found out that he had grown up in Missouri, not far from where her mother's people had come from, which was a small coincidence that felt larger than it was. That he had a sister in Kansas, married, 3 children, with whom he corresponded regularly. That he had started his first cattle operation at 23 with borrowed money, and built it up over 7 years before the partnership dissolved. That the dissolution of the partnership was not, as she had half expected, a story of betrayal or dark secrets, but something more complicated. A man who had been his friend and who had simply made decisions that were wrong and hadn't known how to say so, and the enterprise had come apart not through anyone's villainy but through accumulated avoidance, which was in some ways harder to be angry about. He wasn't dishonest, Silas said. He was just afraid to say when things were going wrong. So they went wronger. That's its own kind of failure, she said. Yes, he said, but it's harder to be angry about it clearly, which I suppose means I've been carrying something that isn't quite anger and doesn't have a clean name. She looked at him across the dinner table and thought about the things she carried that didn't have clean names. There were several. There had been several for a long time. She told him about her parents, which she rarely did, her father's optimism and his borrowing, and his genuine love for this land, and his genuine inability to see consequences until they were already consequence. Her mother's harder pragmatism, which Sadie had inherited as the most useful piece of equipment available to her. The years after her mother died, when it was just her and her father and she had been 19 years old and already the one who made sure things got done. "You've been running this place a long time," he said. "Since I was 19, she said. "My father ran it in theory, I ran it in practice. And when he died, in practice and in theory," she said, he looked at her. Not with pity, she was very alert to pity, had a fine-tuned sensitivity to it, could detect it at considerable distance, and had excellent protocols for shutting down the conversation when she found it. This was not pity. It was the other thing, the thing she still couldn't name, the thing that felt like being seen except without the vulnerability that usually implied or without as much of it, which was strange. Wasn't there anyone who could have helped, he asked, and then carefully, because he clearly understood it was a delicate question, not to say you needed it, but there are some things that are very hard to do entirely alone. She considered this for a moment. She was not in the habit of admitting to the weight of things, because, in her experience, admitting the weight made people either uncomfortable or condescending, both of which were worse than just carrying it. There were offers, she said, from men who thought a woman alone was a problem to be solved, mostly by marriage. He said nothing, but his expression asked the obvious question. "I don't want to be someone's solution to their practical problem," she said. "A woman who has land and no husband is a practical opportunity for certain kinds of men. I was not interested in being that." "No," he said, "I imagine you weren't." He was quiet for a moment and then, "What would you have been interested in?" "If you were willing to think about it." She opened her mouth and closed it and picked up her wine glass. He was watching her with that attention, and the Madeira was warm in her hand and the lamp was burning low and the night outside the kitchen window was full of spring crickets. "A person who saw the whole of it," she said finally. "The land and the work and the reasons behind the work. Not someone who saw a problem and thought they had a solution. Someone who saw what was actually there." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's not an unreasonable thing to want," he said. The evening ended at 9 o'clock, because she had chores at 5 in the morning and he had an early meeting with the man from whom he was purchasing his founding herd, and they stood on the porch in the spring night with the stars very clear and large over the hill country, and he shook her hand again at the porch steps. She had been planning to shake his hand and go inside and be extremely practical about everything she was feeling. She shook his hand. She said good night. He said good night. He walked down the steps. "Silas," she said. He stopped and turned. She stood in the lamplight from the open door behind her and looked at him and said, "Thank you, not for the money. For the rest of it." He stood very still for a moment on the porch steps. Then he said quietly, "You're welcome for the rest of it." He rode away. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time in the dark. She was, she realized, in considerable trouble, not the financial kind. Over the next 3 weeks, the world around Cutter's Creek came into its full spring, which in the Texas hill country was a thing of genuine beauty. The air warm without yet being brutal, the cedar alive and aromatic, the wildflowers coming up in patches along every roadside and hillside, the tanks full from spring rains and the grass deep and green. It was the time of year when the land felt like a promise instead of a demand, and Sadie Blackwell, who loved this land as profoundly as she loved anything, worked in it with the particular physical joy that spring always brought her, the feeling of things growing that she had helped grow. She also, with increasing frequency, encountered Silas Collier. This was partly because the North 40 was adjacent to her property, and he was actively working it now, bringing in a small foundation herd and building the additional infrastructure he needed, and the natural geography of their neighboring operations meant they were often within sight or hailing distance of each other. It was partly because they had both apparently and independently developed the habit of stopping to talk when they crossed paths, which happened more often than could be purely attributed to geographic coincidence. He came back to the homestead on a Tuesday, not for dinner, but because he needed to know where the North 40's property line met the creek, and she had the original survey maps, and they spent 2 hours going over the maps at the kitchen table, and then walked the actual terrain to verify. And somehow they ended up at the stock tank at the edge of the south field in the late afternoon, watching a pair of heron that had taken to nesting in the willows there. And she told him about the herons, that they had been coming to this tank since her father built it, that she watched them every spring, that her mother had had a name for the original pair who came 20 years ago, though the birds now were certainly many generations removed, and he listened to her in that way he had completely, not impatiently, as though the information about herons was something he actually wanted to have. "You know this place the way you know a person," he said. She thought about that. "I've been here my whole life," she said. "I suppose I do." "No," he said. "It's more than that. Most people know their land the way you know a tool, what it's for, what it does. You know it the way you know someone you love. The particular things about it. The herons." She looked at the herons in the willows. She thought about the particular things about places and the particular things about people. She thought about the way he had just described something she had never found language for before. "Yes," she said, "like a person." She did not look at him when she said it. She looked at the herons. But she was aware of him beside her in the way that she had become increasingly, inconveniently, overwhelmingly aware of him, the warmth of him, the particular way he stood in a landscape, the quality of his attention which she had finally, privately, found a name for. He saw her. Not in parts, not the capable part or the landowner part or the practical part or the woman alone on a homestead part. All of it together as the same thing. It was May when Harlan Morse made his next move. She should have anticipated it. She had noted, in Morse's office when she paid him, the small controlled recalibration, and she had known a man like that did not simply accept being outmaneuvered and redirect his energies elsewhere. What she had not anticipated was the specific form it would take. The form it took was this. Morse purchased the Callaway North pasture, which was the land adjacent to her east fence line, through Ben Callaway's son, who had proved willing to sell at the kind of premium that made his father's broken hip a substantial financial event for the family. And then Morse applied to the county land office to have the road easement on the east side of the Blackwell property reclassified, a legal maneuver of some complexity that, if successful, would cut off her primary access to the Cutters Creek Road and force her to use the longer, more difficult western route that added 45 minutes each way to any trip to town. It was not a direct assault. It was a stranglehold, applied slowly. She found out about it from Judge Alderman, who had seen the land office filing and sent her word immediately. She sat in his study on a Thursday afternoon, reading the filing with the focused attention of someone looking for the vulnerability in a trap. "He can't take the homestead," she said. "The debt is paid." "He's not trying to take it," Judge Alderman said. "He's trying to make it untenable. A homestead without reliable road access is worth significantly less and significantly harder to run. If he can also acquire the parcels to the south and west, he can isolate you completely." "And then what?" And then you either sell to him at whatever price he names because you can't function, or you hold on until it breaks you and he waits. She looked at the filing. She looked at the legal language, which was very precise. How long do I have to contest this? 60 days from the filing date. You'd need to demonstrate that the reclassification would cause undue harm to an established prior easement. Which it would, she said. Which it absolutely would, he agreed. But you need documentation, testimony, possibly a lawyer. She went home and spent 4 days going through every paper her father had ever kept, which were extensive and had never been fully organized, in boxes in the back of the smokehouse, where he had stored them with the intention of organizing them someday, which someday had not arrived before his death. She worked through the boxes methodically, making piles, cataloging, reading everything with the careful attention of someone looking for a specific thing. She found it on the third day, a document from 1868, signed by the original Cutters Creek Township administration, establishing the East Road easement as a public right-of-way in perpetuity, connected to the Blackwell property's homestead claim. It was not precisely the legal instrument she needed, but it was evidence of prior establishment that significantly complicated Morse's filing. She also found something she had not been looking for, a second document, much newer, dated 6 months before her father's death. A letter from Harlan Morse offering to buy the homestead for a price that was well below its value, with a note in her father's handwriting in the margin that said he knows about the provision. Being patient. Her father had known Morse was waiting. He had known it and had not told her, perhaps because he had still believed, optimistically, that he would find a way to pay the debt down in time. She sat on the smokehouse floor with the letter in her hands and felt something complicated grief for her father, who had been a man who believed in tomorrow more than today, and anger at the shape of the trap that had been patient enough to wait years to close, and something else, something that was almost protective fury, which surprised her because she had not known she had that kind of fury available. She brought the documents to Judge Alderman. She also, because she was practical about her own limitations and understood that she needed legal knowledge she did not possess, asked him directly who in a 50-mile radius was the best person for this kind of county land dispute. He told her about a lawyer in Mason, Texas, a man named Elias Barker who had successfully contested similar land office filings before. The retainer would be significant. She had $37. She drove home. She sat on the porch in the evening light. She looked at the east fence line, where Morse's newly acquired Callaway land sat on the other side. Then she went and found Silas Collier. He was at his newly established operation on the North 40, which had come along with remarkable speed. He was efficient, and he worked hard, and he had the particular skill of a man who had built something before and knew the order operations needed to happen in. He had a small crew of 2 men helping with the heavy work. The foundation herd was in and settled. It was, in the space of weeks, becoming a real operation. She rode up in the late afternoon, and he came out of the barn and took one look at her face and said, "What's happened?" She told him. All of it, the road easement, the Callaway land purchase, the older letter from her father, the lawyer in Mason, the money she didn't have. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Show me the 1868 document." She gave it to him. He read it carefully. He had the look of a man who was doing something more than reading. He was analyzing, the same way he had analyzed the loan terms, the same way he looked at land and saw past the surface to the structure. "This is strong," he said. "Not conclusive on its own, but strong. Combined with the original homestead claim and testimony about consistent use, this is winnable." "I can't afford the lawyer," she said. He looked at her. He handed the document back. "I'll pay the retainer," he said. "Silas, listen to me," he said. And it was the first time he had used her given name, and she noticed it with the part of her that noticed everything about him, which had become a fairly large part. "This is not charity. My lease on the North 40 depends on your road access. If Morse isolates your property, my operation is compromised too. This is a shared interest. She looked at him for a long moment. She turned the logic over carefully because she needed to be certain he was being accurate and not kind in the guise of accurate. The logic was sound. The lease arrangement did make them operationally interdependent to a real degree. He was not wrong. Shared interest, she said. And also, he said, I am not willing to watch Harlan Morse do this to you. That is the other part. You can classify it as you like. She stood in the late afternoon light on her North 40 looking at this man who had come into her life 6 weeks ago with 4-penny nails, and a quality of attention she had needed a name for, and she felt the practical armor she had worn her entire adult life develop. For the first time, what she could only describe as structural integrity issues. All right, she said. Shared interest. The lawyer, Elias Barker, came to Cutter's Creek the following week. He was a compact, precise man of about 50, with the look of someone who genuinely enjoyed a complicated land dispute, which in 1882 Texas was not a rare specialty, but was a specific skill. He reviewed the documents, spoke with Judge Alderman, interviewed Sadie at length about the history of the road use, and filed a formal contest to the reclassification with the county land office. Morse responded, as expected, with a counterfiling that was long and detailed and expensive to produce, which was itself a message. He had resources and he was willing to deploy them. The hearing was set for 6 weeks out. During those 6 weeks, something shifted between Sadie and Silas, or rather, something that had already shifted continued shifting in the direction it had been going since a day in a general store, when a stranger had known about 4-penny nails and paid attention to the things she was actually saying. They had dinner twice more, once at the homestead and once, by some social calculus that involved me alderman and a church social, and a situation that was very hard to gracefully avoid, in public, which meant that every person in Cutter's Creek had seen them sit together and eat together and talk together for an entire evening, and the town formed its collective opinion, which it expressed through me alderman, who told Sadie over the fence one morning that she approved of Mr. Collier, which in Cutter's Creek was the equivalent of a formal announcement. Sadie thought about telling me alderman that she did not require approval or announcement. She looked at me alderman's genuinely warm, genuinely happy face and said thank you, and went to feed her chickens, and privately agreed that she approved of him too, which was the most devastating thing she had admitted to herself in years. He came to help with a fence repair one morning. She had not asked him. He had simply come over the hill from the North 40 on his horse, seen her at the east fence line with her tools, and got down off his horse and picked up a post-hole digger without a word of discussion. They worked the fence for 3 hours in the June heat, and at some point the work stopped being adjacent work and became collaborative work, the kind where you hand things before you're asked and position yourself to be useful without needing instruction. And she thought about her mother saying once that you could tell everything about a person by how they worked, whether they watched for what was needed or waited to be told. And what working beside Silas Collier told her was something she had already suspected, but which 3 hours of shared fence mending confirmed in a way that was very hard to dismiss. They ate lunch at the east fence line, sitting on the grass with the sandwiches she had made that morning. She had made 2 sets without consciously deciding to, which was another piece of information she filed away about herself with some alarm. Tell me something, she said, because she was a direct person and because something had been sitting in her chest for weeks and she was tired of not knowing what to do with it. He looked at her. When you came to Cutter's Creek, she said, what were you actually looking for? He thought about it for a moment. A place to build something real, he said. Something that was mine, not a partnership this time. Something I could stand behind fully. A cattle operation, she said. A life, he said. A full one. The cattle operation is part of it. She looked at the east fence line stretching out through the June grass. She looked at the Callaway land on the other side of it, which was now Morse's land and which was, for the next 6 weeks, an open question. She thought about full lives and what was in them, and what she had kept herself from wanting because wanting things was efficient only when you had some real chance of getting them. "I've been practical my whole life," she said. "I don't regret it. It's kept me alive and kept this place standing. But there are things that," she started again. "I've kept a very tight inventory of what I let myself want, because the things I couldn't have were easier if I'd never wanted them clearly." He was very still beside her. "What have you wanted?" he asked, quietly, not pushing. She looked at him. It was a long look, and she let it be long, and she let it be honest. "Something like this," she said. "Someone who sees all of it, the work and the reasons for the work, the herons, the four-penny nails." She stopped and then said, because she was not a woman who said things without meaning them exactly, "You." The word sat between them in the June air. He put down his sandwich. He looked at her with the full weight of everything, the gray eyes, the attention, the quality of presence that had been quietly restructuring something in her since the first time she'd encountered it, and he said, "Good, because I have been very carefully not saying something similar for 6 weeks." She laughed. It came out unexpected and real, not the polite social laugh she used in company, but something genuine and startled. And he laughed too. And for a moment they sat in the east fence-lined grass in the June sun, two people who had both been being very carefully patient about something that had been obvious for weeks. He reached over and took her hand. His hand was warm and real and had calluses that matched her own, and she held it with the specific feeling of someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just, for the first time, felt someone else's hand on it. "Sadie," he said. "I know," she said. They sat like that for a while in the June grass. The fence repair could wait. The land office hearing came in late July. The hearing room in the county seat was hot and crowded with people who had an interest in the outcome of Morse versus the Blackwell easement. Because in small hill country communities, these things were never purely private matters. Morse was there with his own lawyer, who was expensive and good. Sadie was there with Elias Barker, who was also good, and with Silas beside her, which was not a legal necessity, but was a thing she was glad of in the specific way of someone who has recently learned the difference between managing alone and not having to. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Barker was methodical and precise, building the case from the 1868 document through the continuous documented use of the easement, through testimony from 3 long-term residents of Cutter's Creek who had witnessed that use for decades, through a careful legal argument about the nature of public right-of-way designations under Texas property law. Morse's lawyer was skilled. He argued the 1868 document was inadequate for the claim Barker was making, that the township had not had the authority to establish a permanent easement at that time, that subsequent land transfers had legally superseded the original designation. The hearing officer, a county judge named Prescott who had been managing Texas land disputes for 20 years and had the particular exhaustion of a man who has seen every variety of predatory land acquisition the frontier could produce, listened to everything with careful attention. He asked questions. He studied documents. He recessed for 45 minutes. When he came back, he said, "The 1868 designation is insufficient as a standalone instrument. However, the continuous and uninterrupted use of this easement for a period of over 14 years, documented and witnessed, establishes an implied easement by prescription under Texas common law that this court is required to honor. The reclassification is denied." Sadie sat very still. She heard Elias Barker saying something about a complete victory. She heard Morse's lawyer saying something about reserving the right to appeal. She heard the gavel come down. The easement stood. Outside the courthouse in the July heat, Elias Barker shook her hand and Silas put his arm around her shoulders in the specific, careful way of someone who is choosing this gesture consciously, and she leaned into it for a moment, which was something she would not have been able to do 8 weeks ago, and which she did now without having to think about it. And that was its own kind of significant. Harlan Morse came out of the courthouse a minute later, flanked by his lawyer. He looked at her. He looked at Silas. He was entirely controlled, no visible anger, which was how she knew he was very angry. He was a patient man and he was not finished. She knew that clearly. But she also knew something she had not known 6 weeks ago, which was that she was not facing this alone. She had an unencumbered deed, a clear easement, a capable lawyer who was now familiar with her situation, and a man who had come to Cutter's Creek looking for a full life and had apparently decided that the full life included her. Harlan Morse nodded at her, very precisely, and walked away. She watched him go. "He's not done," she said. "No," Silas agreed. "But we're still standing," she said. "Yes," he said. "We are." 3 months later, on a Saturday evening in October, Silas Collier came to the homestead with the careful air of a man who has something specific to say and has thought about how to say it. She was on the porch when he arrived, which was where she went in the October evenings when the heat had broken, and the hill country was in its fall, the oak leaves going bronze and the air coming in cool from the north, and the whole world settling into the quiet before winter. She had a cup of coffee and a mending basket she was not doing anything with, and when she heard his horse, she set the cup down and straightened and felt the particular feeling she had come to associate with him, which was something warm and certain that she no longer tried to be practical about because it was a feeling and feelings were not, it turned out, exclusively liabilities. He came up the porch steps. He sat down in the other chair, which had been her father's chair, and which he had been using on evenings when they sat on the porch together, which had become a regular thing, a thing that was part of the texture of how their days worked. He had his hat in his hands. He was turning it. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at the hill country in the October light. "Ask it," she said. "Marry me," he said. Not a question, exactly. He had said he wanted to ask a question and then had not quite asked it but had rather stated it directly, and then seemed to realize this and said, "That should have been a question. Will you marry me?" She looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment. All of it, the gray eyes and the hands turning the hat and the man he was, which she knew in considerable detail now, having spent months in his operational vicinity, and having had enough conversations to understand his texture as a person, the things he valued and the things he was afraid of, and the ways he was trying to be better than his own fears, and the ways he was patient and the ways he was funny, which was a dry, understated humor that caught her off guard sometimes and delighted her. She thought about what she had said in June about keeping a tight inventory of what she let herself want. She thought about what it had cost to want this and whether it was worth it. She already knew the answer to that. She had known it for weeks. "Yes," she said. He breathed out. He put the hat down. He took her hand and she looked down at their joined hands in the October evening light and thought about the first time he had shaken her hand across the kitchen table, the lone document between them, the equal calluses, and how much had happened since then. "I love you," he said. "I should have said that before the question. It's the reason for the question." "I know," she said. "I love you too." She thought about it and then added, "I've been being very careful about saying that for a while." "I know," he said. And he was smiling, the full smile she had come to know, which was not the social smile he used in company but the one that was entirely real and that reached his eyes completely. They were married in December of 1882 in the Cutter's Creek Church, which was decorated with cedar boughs because it was December, and that was what was available, and available things, in Sadie Blackwell's view, were always sufficient. The green dress had been let out slightly at the shoulders and taken in at the waist, and augmented with a piece of cream lace that Mee Alderman had provided from her own considerable stores. And Sadie had looked at herself in the bedroom mirror before the ceremony, and thought about the girl who had started wearing practicality like armor and the woman who was about to walk out of this house and into a different life, and felt the two of them as continuous, as the same person in different seasons. Which seemed right. The whole town came. In a community of 400 people, a wedding was a communal event, and the community of Cutter's Creek had a specific interest in the marriage of Sadie Blackwell and Silas Collier, having watched the thing develop over the better part of a year with the close attention that small towns bring to romances that seem, to them, like the right thing finally happening. Judge Alderman performed the ceremony. Elias Barker, who had become something of a family ally, came up from Mason for it. The Collier operation crew attended. Half the Hill Country Farm sent someone. Harlan Morse did not attend, which was not a surprise, and was perhaps the most comfortable non-attendance of the event. Silas said his vows with the direct, unhesitating quality of a man who has thought about what he's committing to and is entirely willing to commit to it. Sadie said hers with the precision and intentionality she brought to everything. Every word chosen, every word meant, her voice clear and steady and carrying through the December church without a tremor, because she was not afraid of this. She had been afraid of wanting it. She was not afraid of having it. He put a ring on her finger that he had made by the Mason silversmith, a simple band of Texas silver with a small piece of turquoise set into it, because turquoise was something the Southwest had in abundance and silver was the metal of the frontier, and he had thought, apparently, about what the ring should look like and what it should say about the person who would wear it. She had not expected it to have turquoise. She had not expected to feel her throat tighten when she saw it. She was discovering, considerably more capable of feeling things than she had previously given herself credit for. They moved Silas into the homestead after the wedding, which required some physical reorganization and a frank conversation about the house and what was his and what was hers and how those categories worked, and he was entirely uncomplicated about it. He had opinions about where he wanted to put his books, which were more numerous than she had expected, and about the chair on the porch, which he wanted to keep, and about exactly nothing else. She appreciated this more than she said. She said it eventually. He had cattle on the North 40, and they were building the operation steadily, sensibly, with the kind of measured growth that was appropriate for a starting herd in hill country conditions. She continued managing the south and east sections of the homestead, and the combination of their two operations made the overall property significantly more viable than either had been separately. And this pleased her in a deep and practical way that was also underneath, something about the metaphor of it. They managed the Morse situation with consistent vigilance. There were two more legal maneuvers over the following 18 months, an attempt to challenge the water rights on the seasonal creek, which Barker handled cleanly, and a more serious effort to acquire the property south of theirs, which would have created a new kind of pressure. They contested the second one through the county land office with a coalition of neighboring landowners who had their own grievances with Morse's accumulation practices. The coalition held. The land went to a different buyer. Morse ultimately was a patient man, but he was a patient man among many patient people, and the particular combination of Sadie's meticulous documentation, Silas's resources, and Barker's legal skill made the Blackwell homestead an expensive target. By 1884, he had redirected his attention to easier acquisitions further south, and the shadow of him lifted from their particular piece of hill country, not entirely and not forever, but enough to breathe. They had their first child in November of 1884, a boy they named Thomas for Sadie's father, which was Silas's suggestion, and which she received with the particular feeling of someone who has been offered something they did not know they needed until it was offered. Thomas was born in the bedroom where Sadie had been born, delivered by the Cutter's Creek doctor with me Alderman serving as midwife assistant, and when they put him in her arms, he was red-faced and furious and absolutely perfect. Silas sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with the expression of a man who has been quietly afraid of something for months, and has just discovered that the thing he feared is also the most astonishing thing he has ever encountered. He held Thomas with the careful, total attention of someone learning the particular weight and warmth of a person, and Sadie watched him do it and thought about what it meant to see things fully, to look at a person, a place, a life, and not manage the seeing of it, just let it be entirely real. She had learned that from him, or rather, she had already known it about land and herons and fence posts, and he had reflected it back at her applied to herself. And now she looked at her son and her husband in the November lamplight and felt it without armor, without inventory, without the careful management of her own wanting. It was enormous. It was right. She said, "I think he's going to be stubborn." Silas looked at her. "Interesting prediction given the parents." She laughed. He laughed. Thomas, in his arms, made a sound of profound indignation at the laughter, which only made them laugh more quietly, while she recovered, and the November wind came around the eaves of her father's house. They had a daughter the following year, in the autumn of 1886, born with considerable determination, and a pair of dark eyes that seemed to be looking for something specific from the first moment. They named her Clara Me, the me for Mrs. Alderman, who cried when she was told, which was one of the more extraordinary things Sadie had ever witnessed. The operation grew. They expanded the herd by 1887 to 40 head, added a new barn on the North 40, put in a proper well so they were no longer dependent on the stock tank for household water, and turned the kitchen garden into something that supplied not just the household, but enough surplus to sell at the Cutter's Creek weekly market through the summer and fall months. The house changed too, slowly, in the way houses change when people live in them fully instead of just surviving in them. Silas's books accumulated on shelves that he built, and she helped sand. She planted a rose along the south fence that her mother had always meant to plant. The porch acquired a third chair when Thomas was old enough to sit in it. The kitchen table, which had been her parents' table, and before that a tree in some Missouri forest, accumulated the particular scars and warmth of a family that ate at it every day. Ben Calloway, the neighbor with the broken hip, recovered enough by 1885 to be mobile again, and sufficiently embarrassed about what his son had done to make several awkward but genuine overtures of neighborliness, which Sadie accepted because she was not a woman who held grudges when practical alternatives existed, and which Silas accepted because he did not have it in him to be coldly grudging when a man was genuinely trying to do better. Elias Barker visited twice a year, ostensibly on legal business, and actually because he had become fond of both of them, and because meals at the Collier homestead were, by his own assessment, the best he ate in a 50-mile radius. Judge Alderman continued to be Judge Alderman, steady and decent and deeply invested in the well-being of Cutter's Creek, and Me Alderman continued to be Me Alderman, which was its own significant and enduring force of nature. In the spring of 1888, Sadie stood in the kitchen garden in the April morning with 6-year-old Thomas beside her, who was helping her plant beans in the way that 6-year-olds help with gardening, which was more enthusiasm than technique, and looked up at the hill country in its spring, the bluebonnets coming up in the south field as they always did, the cedar aromatic in the warm air, the herons back in the willows by the stock tank. She heard Silas and Clara on the porch. Clara was 2, and Silas was doing the particular thing he did with the children in the early morning, which was hold them while he drank his coffee and tell them things in a low, patient voice about whatever was in his line of sight, the way he had once explained to Sadie about 4-penny nails and fence post physics and what creek access was worth in a dry summer. Clara would not remember the content. She would remember the quality of the attention, the specific feeling of being told things as though they mattered, which was something Sadie knew from experience was a remarkable gift to give a person. Thomas, beside her, was putting the bean seeds in with serious concentration, 1 inch apart, the way she had shown him, and asking her why beans grew underground before they grew above it, and she explained about seeds and soil and the process of germination in the terms she would have used with herself, accurate, complete, not simplified, trusting his intelligence to handle the real answer. He listened with exactly the kind of attention his father brought to things, that specific quality of being entirely present, and she felt the full weight of what she had built here, not alone, not any more, and not diminished by that, but added to, made more real by the sharing of it. She had worn practicality like a second skin her entire adult life. She would always be a practical woman. It was in her bones and her hands and her understanding of the world. It was the thing that had kept the homestead standing and the herons watched and the fence posts solid. She did not regret a day of it, but Silas Collier had looked past it. Not through it, not in spite of it, but past it, to the woman on the other side who had always been there. The one who loved this land like a person, who had feelings she'd been managing for years, who had wanted a full life, and had been keeping that want in inventory because she hadn't yet believed it was something she was allowed to have. He had looked past the practicality and he had seen her, and then he had stayed. He came out of the house now into the April morning, Clara on his hip, and walked down to the garden. And Thomas called Dad in the way children call to parents they are secure in, not urgently, but because they want to show him the beans. And Silas came to look at the beans with genuine interest, and knelt down to examine the placement with Thomas. And Clara reached out from his arms toward the bean rows with the exploratory determination of a 2-year-old in spring. Sadie stood in her garden in the April light and looked at her family and felt the full measure of it, not managed, not practical, not in inventory. Just real, just hers, just the life she was living with her whole self. Finally, the armor set aside, not discarded but transformed into something that was strength without distance, capability without isolation, love with the same clear-eyed honesty she brought to everything. Silas looked up at her from beside the bean rows, and his face held the same quality it had always held with her, that specific, full, seeing attention. And she smiled at him with her whole face, which was a thing she did now without having to decide to. He smiled back. It reached his eyes completely. The bluebonnets were coming up in the south field. The herons were in the willows. Thomas was asking precise questions about beans. Clara was conducting her own investigation of the soil. And Sadie Blackwell, who was now Sadie Collier, who had worn practicality like a second skin her entire adult life, until a rancher had looked past it entirely and seen every part of her worth seeing, stood in her garden in the April morning and thought that this, all of this, the full and real and complicated and beautiful weight of it, was exactly what she had always been working toward, even in the years when she had been too careful to let herself know it. She put her hands in the good earth. She planted the next row of beans. She listened to her family in the morning light. She was home in every sense of the word, and she always would be.